Hello, everyone, and I hope you're doing well. As we start our reflection today, I'd like to begin with a little story. So maybe you've heard this story. It's about an elderly couple. And the elderly man in the couple, he starts to suspect that his wife is getting hard of hearing. So he decides one day to do a little bit of a test. So this old man, while his wife is sitting in a chair, starts walking up behind his wife, and he's doing a little test for her. So when he's a distance away, he yells out to her, "Honey, can you hear me?" And he waits, and he doesn't hear any response from his wife. And then he walks up a little further and he says, "Honey, can you hear me?" Still he waits, no response from his wife. Then he walks up right behind her and he finally shouts right behind her and says, "Honey, can you hear me?" Finally, his wife, very frustrated, turns around and shouts at him, "For the third time, yes, I can hear you." This story is kind of an example often of how we can misunderstand situations. So it was the husband who thought his wife was hard of hearing, when it turns out that he was actually the one who was deaf. In the gospel today, we get a good example of a misunderstanding of a situation. Jesus in the gospel today gives sight to a man who's born blind, and people very much misunderstand what is happening. So we see this in today's gospel, John chapter 9. Jesus gives sight to this blind man, and the way it begins is very interesting. It starts like this. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither he nor his parents sinned. It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him." Jesus' disciples misunderstand the situation, misread it in a serious way. They think that because the man is blind, somebody sinned, either him or his parents, that this suffering of this blindness that this man is going through is somehow God punishing him for some sins of somebody. They misunderstand it. And Jesus corrects them by saying, no, this blindness is not a punishment from God for some sin, but rather God is with this man in his blindness. He's going to work something great through it. In suffering, Jesus does not punish us. God is not there to punish us, but rather Jesus is with us. We too can misunderstand situations, especially during this time of pandemic. Some people might say that this sickness, this illness, this suffering is punishment from God, but that's not the case as we see here from the gospel today. God does not want to punish his people for their sin by making them suffer in this way. Rather, the truth is that God is always with us when we suffer. Jesus accompanies us through our suffering. He's always there with us. This gospel today, then, is a good example of this kind of misunderstanding. We can misread situations. Although Jesus is always with us when we suffer, it can take time for us to learn what he's doing. We can have a growth in faith in times of difficulty to learn more and more what God is working through Christ in our lives. This happens in a very important way in the man who is born blind. So his physical blindness is taken away really at the start of the gospel. Jesus gives him back his sight. But he has this development of faith throughout the gospel that's very, very interesting. As the gospel goes on, this man who was born blind starts to understand more and more who Jesus is, what Jesus can do for him in his life. He has this incredible growth in faith in who Christ is. And this is signified very importantly by the way that the blind man, or the man who was blind and gets his sight back, the way he calls Jesus, the terms he used for Jesus, changes very dramatically as the gospel goes on. So after this man has his sight restored to him, he's in conversation with a lot of different people, with the Pharisees who want to question who Jesus is. And this man begins by calling Jesus these different terms. So at the beginning, just after he's given his sight back, in verse 11, the man says, okay, Jesus is just a man. That's all he is. He's a man. So verse 11, this guy calls Jesus just a man. That's all he is to him. But later, as the gospel goes on, we see his faith begins to deepen. In verse 17, he no longer calls Jesus a man, but now he calls him a prophet. So the man's faith has grown. He's developed an understanding of who Jesus is and how Jesus is working in his life. Finally, towards the end of chapter 9, at the very end, this man comes to Jesus, he has an encounter with him, and he calls him Lord, and he bows down and worships him. So this man, in interacting with Jesus, has a growth of faith. He starts to understand more and more who Jesus is in his life, what Jesus can do for him. Although Jesus is always with us in times of difficulty and struggle, it takes time for us to learn what God is working in these difficult times. In order to grow in our understanding of what Jesus is doing for us in our life, it's helpful to look for the good that is going on even in the midst of difficulty. To understand how God is accompanying us in times of trial, we should try to consciously search for blessings in our life. So during this time of pandemic, of course, there's so many things that we can be worried about, real worries, real concerns, the illnesses that people are going through, maybe people far away or maybe people close to us, the different struggles we encounter as we have to be socially isolated in on our own. I know for myself, I have to be very careful not to read the news too much. It can lead to too much fear and panic. We need to be aware of what's going on, the severity of the situation, and we need to take proper precautions. On the other hand, we have to make sure that all that's happening does not blind us or darken us to the goodness that God is working. God is working, Jesus is with us, but in order to kind of learn or have greater faith in what Jesus is doing, we need to consciously each day search for the good that is happening, look for the blessings that are there. And this kind of takes an effort on our part. So I was reflecting and trying to think of the good things, the blessings that have come out of this situation already. And for me, I'd like to just share two things. When we see all that's happening, what's been very inspiring is the response of a lot of people, the generosity and the service that they're providing, even at the risk of their own selves at times. We can think, for example, of the healthcare providers. This is an incredible blessing, an incredible goodness that's coming out of here. As well, something more closer to home, and I think probably we've all experienced this, is at this time of great difficulty, it's kind of brought people together in a way as well. I look at myself and I see that I've had a lot of conversations with people either on the phone or online, people who I haven't talked to for a long time. And I think a lot of people are experiencing the same, that even in this time of difficulty, God is bringing some good out of it. He's bringing people somehow closer together in a spiritual way, in an emotional way. We're checking in on each other more, even though we're more physically apart. It's going to take a long time for us to understand how God is working through this pandemic, how Jesus is with us, how he's accompanying us. But a helpful way in order to do this is to consciously search for the blessings, the goodness that God is putting into our life. This time is a time of struggle, to be sure. God in this struggle is not punishing us. God is with us. He's going to work some good from it. Jesus is always going to be with us. It takes time, however, for us to learn how Christ is going to be accompanying us, what he'll be doing in our life. So I'd encourage each of us, in order to grow in a greater faith of Jesus, how he's with us, just like this man who Jesus gave sight to. It might be important for us or helpful for us today to try and search for one blessing that's happened during this time. What is one good thing, some glimmer of hope that's come out of this situation for you? Try and do that today, and in fact, it could be a helpful practice to do each and every day. God bless you and take care.